Hello, 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 and welcome to Slay to Z, a tribute to the entire song catalog of one of the greatest bands of all time, Slayer, where every episode we aim to pick, slice, and dissect all things Slayer. Today, we're checking out track 3 from the 1996 album of punk covers, Undisputed Attitude. The song, or songs in this case, are Abolish Government, Superficial Love. This, of course, is a mashup of two separate songs by the legendary LA, Long Beach, California hardcore punk band T.S.O.L, which, for those unaware, stands for True Sounds of Liberty, which I'll admit I have not spent nearly enough time listening to up until creating this episode. Both Abolish Government and Superficial Love were originally released on T.S.O.L's self-titled debut EP in 1981. Given the aggressive sound of the band, the time frame in which the EP was released, again, very early 80s, as well as where the band was from and most active in Southern California, it should come as no surprise that Jeff Hanneman in particular became enamored with them. They were certainly influential to the punkier elements of the Slayer sound, which actually didn't fully start to show up in Slayer's writing until the mid-80s, several years into their existence. But boy, when it did show up, it really helped us solidify what we understand to be that Slayer touch, that little extra magic. Whenever you listen to something like Rain and Blood from 86, I feel like you can really, really hear the punk element come to the surface. So, on that note, let's take a look at those guitars. Now, the guitars are chunky with solid down picking, especially in Abolish Government. And part of what I appreciate about the guitars is that chunkiness, that down picking, we're talking about old school hardcore punk down picking. It's all power chords, not the single note stuff. We're not talking about, the main riff from Master of Puppets or whatever. Like, we're not talking about that kind of stuff where it's, single string, single note, type stuff. We're talking about just chugging away on power chords. And the guitar production itself is less tight a little bit than the typical Slayer release. But I also feel like this is completely in line with just the spirit of the project. Obviously Undisputed Attitude being all about a tribute to punk rock and punk rock influences on the band. What we know about punk rock is it's dirty, it's grimy, it's messy. You even look at similar projects, again, not to invoke Metallica, but Metallica's Garage Days Revisited from 87, famously underproduced and raw sounding. Very much seems to capture the vibe of a band just jamming in their rehearsal space and having fun. Undisputed Attitude, I feel like, really succeeds in kind of capturing the Slayer variation of that vibe. So yeah, just that kind of less polished production and guitar sound in particular, I feel like really contributes to that gritty, livelier feel. I mean, it feels like you're in the room with these guys, which is great, especially for the material involved. Now, for the most part, like I said, I really enjoy the guitar work on this track, but there is one questionable piece of kind of guitar work or like melodic color. I don't even know if I want to call it melody necessarily, but one little flare that's dropped in during the Superficial Love part of the track. In particular, the like where Tom is singing Peacetime, Wartime, Countries in Vain. There's a little weird lead guitar part behind that. Some big off-kilter kind of bends. Wow, 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 wow. I hate it. Just flat out, I hate it. hate it so much. I love so much of the guitar work on this track and this album in general. It's super, it's on point. But that little flare, which by the way is not in the original T.S.O.L version, it's just, it's nails on a chalkboard for me. I just don't like it. I just don't feel like it's necessary, and the only thing it contributes to the track is just a weirdness. But the guitars, like I said, otherwise guitars are great. They're fantastic. I'm here for it. As far as bass, again, I love the bass sound on this record. It's just this great, nasty, distorted, or really heavily overdriven punk rock bass sound that's just so delicious. It's so round and fat and, again, just dirty. And you get a really good snapshot into that bass sound during the breakdown of the song, where it's just drums and bass, or just bass and kick drum, really. It's really cool to hear, and it just, again, contributes so much to the overall just feel of the track. Absolutely, I'm here for it. Along those lines of the bass sound, I do seem to recall reading somewhere over the years that either Carey or Jeff actually recorded most of the bass parts on Undisputed Attitude, not Tom. I feel like maybe I read somewhere that there was an exception on Gemini, but I'm not positive about that, given what we know now about, even albums that came after this, and how Carey essentially handled all the guitar and all the bass with the exception of Hanneman's solos. So I haven't been able to verify for this particular album, but I think it's probably safe to say that Carey or maybe Jeff were playing the bass in the studio for these covers. Either way, it definitely is different from the usual Slayer vibe. Again, it's nastier, punkier. Yeah, it's awesome though. It's great. It contributes so much to the overall vibe. And as far as verifying what the actual arrangement was for recording the bass in the studio, Carey, Tom, Paul, or even Dave Sardy, who worked on the record, if you're listening and you care to set the record straight, I'm more than happy to share this platform with you to do so. So anyways, that's pretty much all for the stringed instrument stuff, guitars and bass. Again, very simple song, not a whole lot going on, but doesn't need to be much going on to still be awesome. So, all right, let's listen to some drums. Now, Paul Bostaph is predictably rock solid through the whole song. And what I love in particular is he never seems to overplay the track. Obviously that's a hallmark of metal and thrash metal, and Slayer in particular is overplaying the drums. Big, ridiculous drum fills, roll downs on the toms, whatever, all that stuff. That's not really here on this song. Bostaph really sticks with the spirit of kind of that early 80s West Coast hardcore punk vibe. Just very straightforward for the most part. And I think that in itself elevates the track so much, because we start doing these huge roll downs and these Lombardo fills and everything else. It starts to take a punk rock track and push it too far in the metal direction. Obviously, Slayer doing punk songs, or really any songs, is going to push things in a metal direction already just by default. But there's not a need to go so over the top to get the point across. So props to Bostaph, whether it was his decision and arrangement on his part, or whether he was kind of being, coached or guided or whatever by the other members of the band or the producer. Whatever the case is, he really knocked it out of the park. I also really love the floor tom rolls during the transition or intro piece going into Superficial Love. He's just shredding just on that floor tom. Like, it just carries the momentum so well during that transition. But speaking of momentum, even whenever they get to the like I mentioned earlier, the kick drum and bass breakdown. I mean, he's just sitting there just hitting, whatever it is, quarter notes or whatever, or eighth notes on the kick drum. That's it. Snare, snare. Like that alone is so simple, but man, it really speaks to that old adage of like sometimes less is more. Just having that kind of carry that along with the bass, carrying the momentum of that transition to the next part of the track. It's so perfect, just so well executed, again, for something so simple and so understated, especially for Slayer. It's just a nice variation on that riff, and I think that's a pretty clever little arrangement trick, right? Instead of just same beat, same beat, same beat, roll down, same beat, same beat, same beat, roll down. No, break it up. Do something a little bit different because it keeps things engaged. And I realize as I'm saying this out loud how ridiculous it may sound, because this whole song is what? It's 2 tracks in like less than 2 minutes. Like, how could anybody possibly get bored? But everything's moving so fast that it can become repetitive because you're covering a lot of ground in a short space of time. So that leaves a lot of space to play the same parts over and over again or whatever, or have boring ass transitions where it doesn't really matter. So again, all that to say, props to Bo staff for really handling it and really having a great showing on this record. And just as a side note, just my own amusement, I guess, this track is one of the very few tracks on this record that doesn't have this ridiculous, comically fast hi-hat count in at the beginning of the song. The 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't have that. They just go straight into the track. I even as a teenager, whenever I first bought this record, that always stuck out to me, and it was always like a point of joking and laughing around, me and my buddies that listened to Slayer with me. We would put on this record, and then we were all just counted off 1, 2, 3, 4. It's so ridiculous. I love it so much, but at the same time, it's nice to not do that on every single song because it's so ridiculous and it could be so repetitive, and it might even get not age well, right? Start to get kind of annoying over time. So, anyways, that's the drums. That's Bo staff. Way to go! Knocked it out of the park. Maybe the MVP on this track. So the lyrics seem to veer between like this overt political dissent and social commentary, which obviously we expect from, hardcore punk, because it's just by its nature is a overt social commentary, politically charged genre. But anyways, it kind of veers from starting off in that place to something else. And I gotta say, I'm not really a huge fan of the lyrics on this track. I think they're kind of silly. I think they're punk rock, so there's, it's not super deep stuff, I guess, but I don't know. They just don't sit with me. I don't hate them, but also there might be a slight level of cringe involved there. Just a little tiny, inkling of cringe. So not crazy about them in that respect. But I do appreciate that Slayer saw it fit to ditch everything in Abolish Government after the second verse, because the original song really seems to wear out its welcome pretty quickly. It just kind of rambles a bit, especially like I was saying earlier for a punk rock song. Like, get to the point and get out. It meanders a little bit once you get past that second verse. Props to them for editing a little bit, and not even out of a sense of like we got to cram all this shit onto one album, make it fit. It sounds like they kind of said, no, we don't need that. We'll cut that. We'll squeeze these two together, and this will be a perfect thing. And it keeps the momentum going appropriately. Now, true to form, Slayer adds their touch to the end of the track. So on the original T.S.O.L. version, if you haven't heard it, there's this tag at the end of Superficial Love where Jack Grisham, the singer, just spouts off, President Reagan can shove it. Okay? Again, totally in line with the early 80s punk rock ethos and everything else, and very anti-Reagan and everything else. Cool, get it. Here, keep in mind, this album dropped in, 96? So, times have changed, different leaders. It doesn't make a lot of sense to sit there and, holler about Reagan and how much Reagan sucks. So, here goes Tom. He ad-libs the back end of it a little bit, and he kind of slyly grumbles out, President Clinton can suck my motherfucking dick. Hilarious. Objectively, I think it's funny. Now, the back end of that, it hasn't aged super well in some respect. I think because, here we are 20 years later, 30 years later, in trying to express that kind of punk rock ideology, Slayer instead kind of produced a little more fuel for that old tired argument of, like, are they Nazis? Are they fascists? Are they right-wing, whatever, lunatic people, whatever, which by and large they're not. That's a whole different discussion. Not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that here, especially because I don't know these guys personally, and I would venture to say probably 99% of anybody that's listening to this doesn't know any of these guys personally. So it's all speculation for the most part. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like, it just doesn't hold up particularly well. But I do remember listening to this in the 90s and really thinking it was the funniest thing ever. Of course, it probably also had something to do with being in high school at the time. So, maturity level, I guess. Okay, so what myself and I'm sure many others find interesting and appealing about this album is that it seems to represent more polished but no less aggressive versions of these old punk songs. Now, listening to the source material or recordings, not just T.S.O.L, but most of these bands represented on Undisputed Attitude, it really seems to underscore that old cliche about classic punk rock being bereft of truly great players. I've always been fascinated with hearing these cleaned up versions of these songs that, in their original incarnations, are sometimes almost comically sloppy. But also, I get it. Punk rock is truly like the sum of its parts. And one of the most important parts is the attitude, the conviction, the disaffectedness. Honestly, if I had been around at that time, I probably would have gravitated to that sound and that whole subculture, in the early 80s. There was criticism lobbed at Slayer for exactly this reason. People's estimation that they just seemed to miss the point by kind of quote-unquote Slayerizing the songs and thereby stripping them of their essence. I don't know, man. To me, that sounds like kind of pretentious gatekeeping bullshit to me, which gatekeeping it's a very real, very persistent presence in the metal scene and the punk scene and probably most scenes, I would imagine, especially once you get under that really popular, bubble on the top, you get a little bit more underground, even relatively shallow underground like a Slayer or, in the punk rock world, T.S.O.L, who are legends. But yeah, it just comes across as just self-important, self-aggrandizing bullshit. Abolish Government and Superficial Love, the Slayer versions, rule. And honestly, 2 songs in under 2 minutes with that wrist-burning down-picking and the political, if sometimes nonsensical lyrics and a certain vocal snarl, that seems pretty fucking punk rock to me, man. All that said, where do we place Abolish Government and Superficial Love in the catalog ranking? Well, since this is only our second track, I think spot number 2 makes the most sense for now. I can assure you that it's going to run into strong competition for that position in pretty short order. But for now, we can bask at the unlikely proposition of a track from Undisputed Attitude, the Covers record, taking second all-time place in the career ranking for Slayer's recorded output. Can we get a slow clap for that? That's incredible. Well done. Enjoy it while it lasts. Moving forward, next episode, we're going to do a bonus track from the God Hates Us All sessions in 2000-2001 for a song called Addict. You can find this song, again, on, I think, the Asian versions of the God Hates Us All album, as well as, of course, in the Soundtracks to the Apocalypse box set. So please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're hearing this. If you want to drop a line to the show directly to give me a attaboy pat on the back, correct me, or tell me why you disagree, I'm happy to read your messages at slaytozpod@gmail.com. That's SLAYTOZPOD@gmail. Thanks for listening, and as always, remember...